The meeting of two cultures is often accompanied by the flow of cultural information and technology. From a lighter point of view, this exchange is often obscured or unrecognized. For example, when the Spanish explorers first came to the New World, they encountered cultures that seemed incredibly foreign. Surprisingly, to the modern English speaker, the words canoe, hurricane, and barbecue, and crops forming the basis of many European cuisines, such as tomatoes and potatoes, all come from the indigenous populations of this contact period. Since the age of exploration, such instances of first contact have become increasingly rare. This does not mean, however, that cultural exchange has halted. On the contrary, the modern globalization of the economy and of entertainment have provided new opportunities for cultural contact. Most likely due to its role in both world wars and an influential economy, the United States has become a powerful player on this new global stage. As researchers and tourists alike can attest, it has now become common to encounter English all around the world. It is worthwhile, however, to recall what is so obvious in the earlier examples of cultural contact. Linguistic borrowing is often associated with technological borrowing. Thus, the exponential increase in technological inventions produced in English-speaking countries, namely the United States, since World War II, have encouraged multilingualism, code switching, and borrowing. As the rate of invention is exponential, other countries often simply do not have time to coin their own terms for these new technologies. This first graph shows some of the major inventions and events in world history. You can see that as population increases and we get closer to the present day, more and more things get invented. This second graph shows the expected advancement in technologies over the next 5 years. As you can see, there's a projected 32-fold increase. Technological terms are readily flowing into countries rapidly attempting to improve their economies, such as those of Latin America. Interestingly, language management is a collective procedure relying on both individual and institutional regulation. This often results in a separation between the official and informal uses of language. Official institutions sometimes make strong attempts to preserve the integrity of their national languages. For example, in Germany, a language revitalization program during the 1900s involved the translation of many adopted foreign terms, such as the English chain smoker, into literal German equivalents, a process called calquing in linguistics. It seems likely, then, that there may be some efforts to make new Spanish terms to accompany these new technologies. The question thus becomes, given the exponential increase in technologies, has it been possible for Spanish as a language to keep up? How is this reflected in Spanish speakers' use of English versus Spanish terms? And is there a difference between the institutional, formal language of technology and informal vernacular? In order to investigate these questions, I chose to analyze two different sources. The first is instructional how-to videos found on an online blog. These specific videos were chosen because they have the highest number of views of the how-to videos on YouTube. By chance, they happen to belong to the same blog. This first data set represents bottom-up language management and the more vernacular use of language. Therefore, I wanted the second set of data to represent top-down language management. Thus, I chose to analyze dictionary entries of the Real Academia Española, something essentially equivalent to Merriam-Webster for English. I analyzed approximately 6 videos and 40 dictionary entries, and also often chose to look up the technological terms that I was hearing in the videos in the dictionary so that I could directly compare the two. Before discussing my data and the frameworks I will be using to analyze it, it is important for you to understand the vocabulary of language contact and lexical borrowing. Authors tend to use two terms in relation to this phenomena, borrowing and code switching. According to Yaron Matras, an author writing extensively about the phenomena in the context of bilingualism, borrowing and code switching can be seen as two ends of a continuum, as I have represented them here. Borrowing is distinguished from code switching as the diachronic process by which one language gains new vocabulary from another. Code switching is spontaneous language mixing. From reading Matras's work and comparing it to the work of other authors, it seems to me that code switching can be understood as the speech act related to the process of lexical borrowing. Let's move on to the frameworks that I will be using. Myers-Scotton was one of the first linguistic anthropologists to carry out extensive cross-cultural analysis of language borrowing. I will thus be using some of her findings to frame my data. Firstly, Myers-Scotton found that there are two types of borrowed word forms, cultural and core. Cultural forms are new concepts to a borrowing language. No established word is in existence. On the other hand, poor forms are items that do have an equivalent, but are still adopted into the borrowing language anyway. Next, Myers-Scotton suggests that in situations of language borrowing and code switching, there is always a marked language and an unmarked language. The marked language is the default language, the one that would be expected in a given situation. Unmarked languages are the non-default languages, and picking to use an unmarked language is thus always purposeful. This element of choice leads me to my last framework, this time supplied by Mattress again. The rational choice model builds upon the model of markedness, as it states that social knowledge is incorporated into a speaker's choice of language. In particular, discourse functional choices are made when code switching in a conversation matches the meaning of a specific utterance, signaling transitions between layers of discourse. These frames explain the nitty-gritty of lexical borrowing, but the question still remains, why and how are words actually borrowed? To answer this, I turn to the edited volume of Rosenhaus and Counter. In it, they suggest that terms are borrowed due to a need for new terminology, because one language is seen as more prestigious, and during the formation of closed groups. The linguistic terms actually can be borrowed because of direct contact, such as tourism, mass media, such as the internet, and education systems. I'll be focusing on the transmission due to mass media, as it fits within my interest of technology. That was a lot of background. Let's now use what we learned to look at the instructional videos and dictionary entries. First, let's look at the how-to videos. I found that terms for software and hardware tended to be direct borrowings from English, with no translation involved. Examples include la computadora, Gmail, el internet, and mouse. This category also includes all the terms for units of measure, byte, kilobyte, megabyte, etc. Most other nouns related to technology are directly translated into Spanish. If you remember, this is a linguistic process called calquing. For example, hard drive is el disco duro, and window is la ventana. Interestingly, even in the directly borrowed English words for hardware and software, all are pronounced with Spanish phonemes, and many take on Spanish spellings. I struggled a little with the verbs that I was hearing in the videos. They seem to be of English origin and translation, but, for example, cut is cortar, but all seem to have been adopted into Spanish at an earlier point in time. For example, all have other meanings in Spanish. Potentially, this could be seen as a borrowing of English ideas for technological processes into Spanish. Do you guys have any suggestions? The dictionary entries of the Real Academia Española actually turned out very different. Many of the words that I had heard in the how-to videos that I watched were not even recognized by the dictionary, especially the nouns that were direct English borrowings like mouse, web, and spam. Even la computadora was not recognized as a standalone word, but had to be el computador electrónico. Originally, I had not planned on looking at the definitions. I was just going to see which words made the cut into the official Spanish dictionary. But as I started looking through the terms, I noticed something interesting. When there was a choice between a Spanish technological term and a borrowed English term, the Real Academia always chose the Spanish. Thus, ordenador, a phrase my Spanish-speaking friends have told me is almost never used, takes the place of computadora, and even byte is defined as octeto. However, it seems that there has been a change in language management policy. Some dictionary entries are marked with the announcement, new from the 23rd edition. It is the 22nd edition that the majority of the entries are coming from. I believe the 23rd edition is forthcoming. In these entries, many more English borrowings can be found, such as internet and chat. Furthermore, in the definitions used in these entries, ordenador is replaced by the English borrowing computadora. Clearly, something has changed. These entries are also often marked as borrowed from English. So, what can we say about the borrowing of English technology into Spanish from these two data sources? As many researchers have found across cultural boundaries, nouns are more readily borrowed than verbs. These nouns all seem to be what Myers-Scotton calls cultural forms, filling a lexical gap. Although Spanish is the unmarked language in Spanish-speaking contexts, as the language associated with these technological forms and the economies that run on these technologies, it makes sense within the rational choice model for English to be used. In other words, English could potentially even be seen as the unmarked language in technological contexts. Furthermore, I would suggest that as English is associated with these impressive economies, English serves as a prestige language, and knowledge of even the few English terms associated with technology thus boosts the speaker's social standing, or at least index a connection to success. Interestingly, My research showed that there is a difference in vernacular and formal usage of these borrowed English terms, with formal institutions attempting to restrict the uses of English. However, this does seem to be in a state of fluctuation. As a side note, I am not a native Spanish speaker, and I thought it would be interesting to search some of these same words in an English-Spanish translator. Multiple translators that are on the internet also did not recognize some of the borrowed English terms as Spanish. In conclusion, I was intrigued by the dismissal of the borrowing of technological terms as worthy of research in many studies. You can think of our reading on Spanglish in Puerto Rico by Rose Nash. It is seen as a given that these terms are borrowed merely in an attempt to fill lexical gaps. However, as shown by the analysis of my data through the different analytical frameworks, this can be understood as a more complex problem. People are also signaling and indexing an association with the largest economies of the world. Along with the questions I asked during the presentation, I would like to ask these 4 questions. Did you find my analysis convincing? Which framework was the most helpful? Which text from our class readings would be the most useful to include? And is it worth keeping directly borrowed and borrowed but translated phrases separate? Thanks.